So I believe that we have these things which I'm just going to call nouns, just to continue the analogy, and that's the data that we have the most of. What occurred where and when is the essential construct of that sort of data. But then we have things which tell us about membership, and that's things like taxonomies, phylogenetic trees, ecological communities, that something belongs within a set of something else. And then the third thing that we have is what I'm going to call verbs, which is that some organism performs a certain action on another organism. It can be this organism pollinates that organism, or this organ consumes that organism, or this organism is a host to that organism. Okay, and that's what actually holds this whole biosphere together. The real issue in bioinformatics, I believe, is not the complexity of the biodiversity information, but the complexity of the organizational structures out there that we have to get to communicate with each other. So we not only have users and providers of data, but often we have a whole class of organizations in between, which are essentially data brokers and intermediaries, and many of our users are also providers, so it all gets very complex, and there's a large number of organizations in that which we have to really work hard to make interoperable. One of the problems that we face is the proliferation of biodiversity information. Let's just take that very simple 2010 target, setting out to reduce the rate of biodiversity loss. Very simple target. Well, that quickly turned into 5 separate goals, each of which had several sub-targets, each of which had a whole bunch of indicators. Now, you come into the political arena with a very simple target, which says, let's reduce the rate of biodiversity loss, and then you provide them with 40 different bits of information, some of which are going up, some of which are going down. And the natural response of a decision maker under that circumstances is, go away until you've, decided what the problem is, don't bother me. So we really need to work towards information integration rather than information divergence. And here's an example of one thing that we developed that pulls together 4 major sorts of biodiversity information and actually pulls them together into one summary number rather than breaking them out into multiple indicators. So you can unpack that if you want to, but it helps you to see the convergence of information rather than the divergence of information. The whole purpose of indicators is to make things simpler for decision makers, not to make things more confusing for information, for decision makers. Let me talk a little bit about some early products. This is the year of biodiversity. It's the big convention on biodiversity conference in Nagoya in October. This is for the biodiversity community, the equivalent of the Copenhagen conference in Denmark of last year, really a moment of truth. And we will be launching a number of products in this year to demonstrate our capability to do some of these things. Here's an example of interoperability. Now, previously, there were data sets on the occurrence of species, this what occurs where, and they mostly occurred in museums and herbaria and places like that. There were completely separate data sets on which areas of the world are protected, so the vectors of the surrounds of protected areas. And those two didn't speak to each other at all. Well, through the combined efforts of a group of people, the World Conservation Monitoring Center and GBIF in particular, they've developed a widget which allows you to actually interrogate those things simultaneously. You can pull those things in simultaneously and tell what fraction of the world's species are actually in protected areas, or for a particular protected area, what is the list of species that occurs there. And you can do that all over the world, including places where information is really sparse. So I'm going to just touch on a few things that are in the implementation plan. They're not everything that's there, it's some of the sexy stuff. We're working quite a lot at the gene level of biodiversity. Now, that's important because there's been an explosion in bioinformatics information at the gene level. Basically, they have these little devices, these little robotic devices that you feed some biological material in at one end and it cranks away for a couple of hours, and it spits out a couple of terabytes of data at the other end telling you about the gene sequences, that are in that. And this is going on all the time in hundreds of laboratories around the world, and it goes into massive databases, and that's completely disconnected from the rest of the biodiversity world. There often actually isn't even a species location or a species ID that's associated with that. So getting that lot connected is absolutely critical. And the focus here, because the world is so massive, our focus is in these things called edge species, which are evolutionarily distinct, globally endangered species. If we have to start somewhere, if we have to prioritize somewhere, we should start with the things that are highly endangered and contain a library of evolutionary information which is unique, which if we lost that, we would be losing several billion years of evolutionary history. One of the things that we're planning to come out with, in fact, we're already well on the way towards that, is maps of phylogenetic diversity. So you might have seen maps of where are the species of the world, where are the so-called hotspots of biodiversity around the world. But the real question is, where are the hotspots of evolutionary history in the world? Because those are the bits that we need to protect. Just protecting a place that's got a lot of species that are all very similar to each other doesn't really help us as much as protecting those bits which have this evolutionary memory captured in them. At the species level, there's activities going on land, in freshwater, and in the ocean. This is the most developed area, so we can get into quite a lot of detail on this, and especially around certain groups of species, certain taxa, which are particularly well known. Basically, all of the vertebrates, all of the higher plants, we can actually say a lot about. We're having to now push those into the invertebrates, and we're starting with certain key groups which are better known than others. For instance, on land, the butterflies. There's been butterfly collectors for 300 years, and they've been collecting information, capturing that. We use a lot of citizen science here, a lot of lay observers, lay ornithologists who go out on a Sunday morning with a pair of binoculars and tick off what species are. So lots of interesting developments in that area. And here's an example of a really remarkable product. For the last 50 years, ships of opportunity crossing the North Atlantic have trailed plankton nets, and when they get to port on the other end, they take that and they give it in, and someone scores the species one. That's been being collected for the last 50 years, and now we have pictures of how the plankton diversity of the North Atlantic has been changing over that period. And it tells a remarkable story of global warming and its consequences on this fundamental property of the biology of the oceans. At the ecosystem scale, we're working hard for the first time to put in place a shared ecosystem classification and mapping system for not only terrestrial ecosystems, but also freshwater ecosystems and marine ecosystems. And then to embed this idea of ecosystem services, the value that people get from nature, into national accounts, into the statistical bodies which collect information about the wealth of nations, essentially. Part of their wealth is their natural wealth, and we need to account for it, otherwise we needlessly lose it. So that's really the activities of the Biodiversity Observation Network. It's starting to come together. This is a key year for it, and we hope to be able to turn the bioinformatics side of this question around, and in time help to turn around the loss of species worldwide in this particular year of Biodiversity 2010.